Good morning. It's 11 o'clock. It's time to begin. Today we are going to be hearing URICA student presentations. Every year, students have the opportunity to apply for an undergraduate research internships and creative activity grant. If you take the first letter of each one of those words, that spells the word URICA. The proposed projects for this grant are original in the sense that both the student and the faculty supervisor are engaged in a process of true discovery. This year, 7 grant winners are going to present the results of their projects this morning. Here are the presenters with their discipline and the project title. Jared Kaufman in mathematics, Weather by the Numbers, a look into mathematics and weather. Hanna Watts, biology, genetic diversity of olive ridley turtles in South Pacific, Mexico. Bethany Powell's English and history, From Nursery to Narnia, romanticized girlhood in Victorian children's literature and the writings of C.S. Lewis. Annie Carlson in biology, variations in cortisol levels across women's menstrual cycles. Emma Beachy, history and music, acculturation and tradition, Mary Oyer, and expanding social conscience in Mennonite music. Sandy Dow, biology, the antimicrobial effects of essential oils. And Natalie Graber, natural sciences and psychology, physical therapy for acute musculoskeletal injuries, the role of patient-therapist relationships on patient-perceived rehabilitation success. Oh, I was hoping I'd get through that long title, and I didn't succeed. Anyway, we are so glad to have all of these students here today give us presentations. They have a PowerPoint with presentations that'll go one after the other, and when we're done, we'll take questions. They'll line up in the front here, and I will then organize the question time. But in the meantime, as Jared Kaufman comes up and starts the presentation, let's give them a hand.
Good morning. Like Bob said, my name is Jared Kaufman, and my research presentation title is Weather by the Numbers, a look into how mathematics and weather tie together. Now, what I'm going to be going over in this presentation details my money usage, what I've been doing here with my project and my internship as well, and what I have learned over the course of this internship. So for starters, I have been using the URICA funds to purchase radar software and model software as well. One piece of software in particular that I have been looking at is RadarScope, which gives me the chance to look at your traditional radar as well as see wind velocity in storms, and also gives radar estimates on how much rain has fallen over a particular area in a particular amount of time. Now, my internship this year has been at KWCH down in Wichita, and so there I have been shadowing the meteorologist. What this looks like is generally just watching what they do, seeing how they flip through the models, asking questions, that sort of a thing. And then after this, after about a month, they said, here, how about you do a forecast? And so I was able to make forecasts, compare them, see how well I do, and then I have been producing as well after that, which involves creating graphics for shows, and then finally getting up in front of the green screen, which has definitely been one of my favorite things to do so far. Thank you. So what I have learned during this experience is math is not done by hand. A lot of stuff is done by computers, and I'll show you some equations that demonstrate exactly why people do not work through these by hand. Learning is a process, certainly in the field. It is a little intimidating to be surrounded by professionals who are very good at what they do every single day, but if you recognize that you're a student, they help you learn through your process. Monologuing in front of the green screen is very, very difficult. We don't get teleprompters like the rest of the news people do, so we kind of just have to come up with stuff off the top of our head. So that's a process and learning by itself. Very difficult, but it gets easier with time. And then this diagram called the skew T is important. I'll hopefully get to that at the end of the presentation and show you what that's all about. So these equations up here they're a little hard to see, but they deal with a lot of third level calculus, differentials, differential equations. These look very scary. The point of me showing you these is not to scare you, but rather to demonstrate that we really do not do math by hand. Some time ago, some people smarter than us came up with ways to plug these into a computer, and that's why we just don't do them by hand. But from these equations, we can get several key products that we can look at. So right here, we can see the position of the jet stream as modeled in this model from pivotal weather. So we can see here that these streaks here show that it's kind of streaking through Wisconsin and Illinois. And so under this ridge, we would expect, under this ridge, which kind of falls in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, we might expect to see warmer than average temperatures, which is kind of what we see here. So we can see here, this is a temperature anomaly graph. We can see temperatures here are about 10 to 12 degrees warmer than normal. Other than that, it's a little hard to see, but these maps also model wind vectors, which show us the direction of the wind. And then this product here is kind of an atmospheric stirring process, which helps us determine if it's going to rain or not. Now this graph here, this is QT, this is what I was demonstrating earlier, talked about earlier. This is weather balloon data. And so on top of plotting wind vectors and stuff like that along the right side of it, we can also see that where these red and green lines touch, we would expect to see a cloud layer where these come into contact with each other. So that's just some of the model information that I get to look at and get to process whenever I go down to Wichita. Ultimately providing me with a very good experience to work on my project and see how math and weather further relate. So these are my citations for the pictures that I've used. I'd like to thank the URICA committee for granting me the grant, and Dr. Brenna Haynes for serving as my academic advisor through this entire process. Thank you.
Hi, I am Hanna Watts, and I did a genetic diversity study of Ridley turtles in South Pacific Mexico. So I got the Eldon Rich Fund. It's not necessarily URICA, but it kind of goes through the URICA system. So I went to 3 different places. I went to Tuxtla, where I landed. I went to Puerto Arista, and then I went to Chonola. So what I've been doing is I've been collecting blood samples from dead neonates. These are turtles that didn't survive the birthing process. We try our hardest, and we help a lot of the process of them getting from egg to a little baby turtle by collecting them, making sure that they stay safe, and then when they do start to hatch, we start to dig that up so that there's less decomposing of eggs. But there is some that don't survive, and those are the ones that I took. And then those, during the time in Puerto Arista, about 5 to 6 weeks, I was interning at a turtle camp. And that's where I would also help them collect eggs and do a whole bunch of other stuff, as well as pick up trash on the beach. And then this is Puerto Arista. This is the crew that I was working with over there. And then the dead turtles are right there. Those are the ones that I was taking. I was just using an insulin needle just to take their blood. And then what we would do is preserve it in a Eppendorf tube and make sure that they stay preserved until I could get to the lab because it was super hot where I was at. What I've been doing, so I also collected shark blood as well in Toluna because I didn't think I had enough samples for my study, however I do. But we also collected blood from sharks, and then I worked in the lab in Tuxtla with Sergio, if anyone's ever met Sergio. And we worked for about 2 weeks in the lab trying to extract DNA and do PCR. And this is the lab, and then this is also Toluna. And then where my funds went, basically it went to my trip. Food and water, flights, transportation, and miscellaneous expenses overall. I was in Mexico for almost 2 months for the whole time, so I had to make sure that I could live off of that. And then this is some of the awesome food that I also got to eat while I was there. I'm also working on right now doing more of the literature review. Like, I'm waiting for all my DNAs to be sequenced, so from Korea. And so we're waiting to ship that off and then bring it back so I can go over that data. So I'm right now just reading a lot of articles. And this is just some other cool photos that I got from my trip, so yeah. And I would like to acknowledge Fran, Sergio, Emilio, Lulu, and the crew from the camp, because they really, really helped me out through this whole time. I couldn't have done it with especially Fran and Sergio and Emilio. They really were key partners trying to make this awesome trip and this awesome research project happen. And then I would also like to thank the people behind the Eldon Ridge Fund. So thank you.
Hello. So like Bob mentioned, my name is Bethany Powell, and I'm a double major in English and history. So my project had to sort of encompass both of those majors, which is why the paper is so long. It's supposed to be 65 pages at the end of all of this. And the title of my project refers to an exploration of 19th century children's literature in England, in addition to analyzing the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. My initial plan had centered more around studying fairy tales and fairy tale culture, but I realized about 15 to 20 sources in that would require more historicizing of German and Danish material than I wanted to do, and it wouldn't focus on C.S. Lewis as much, and he was my main focal point. So the thesis for my project turned out to be writings for children depicting children as produced by the Romantic movement and the Victorian period perpetuated an ideal standard of appropriate conduct, innocence, morality, and connection to the divine in girl children specifically, which is emulated in C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia through his portrayal of children and Narnia itself. And so within this incredibly long statement, there are several themes or threads that I have chosen to follow. And the first of those refers to Romanticism during the 19th century, which is sort of an ideal fixation on nature, imagination, childhood, emotions, and individualism. It was at its peak during the early and mid-19th century, and also into the Victorian era, which is where I get to focus. So I'm going to look specifically at what the Romantics thought children, female children specifically, should be like and how that manifested in their writings during this time period, and also how they influenced society in that way, and how they believed romantic ideals were a necessity when it came to connecting with or teaching morality. The second thread that I get to follow traces these ideas and themes during the Victorian period as literature in England entered its golden age. And these ideas were altered a little bit to better suit changing expectations for female children, and it also connected enormously to standards of morality as well. And then the largest and final section of my paper will look at C.S. Lewis, his background and development. As I mentioned before, he wrote The Chronicles of Narnia, which is a very popular children's series, and it featured a pretty good example of what he felt children should be like. And in the research I've done, it's fairly clear that Lewis was inspired by Romanticism, particularly during the Victorian period. And I will spend the last 15 to 20 pages of this doing a literary analysis of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe specifically. So yeah, it's a lot. I gathered all of my sources this summer and annotated them with the sort of flexibility that the grant provided. So I was pretty ready to start writing in September. I have completed proposals for both departments, and then I wrote my literature review. I've also drafted about 25 pages of content outside of my literature review, which puts me closer to the 65-page goal. And a lot of that includes historicizing. Over break, I plan to do the literary analysis part. In conclusion, I'd like to thank my primary advisor, Brad Bourne, as well as Mark Jansen, who's overseeing sort of the history side of things. Siobhan Scarry got me started, and Kip Weedle's also going to be helping more in spring semester. I'd like to thank the URICA committee for the grant, as well as all of our librarians. They have been absolutely wonderful. The Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College has been wonderful for providing material on C.S. Lewis, and also my mod has been amazing, and they have tolerated a lot of books. So with that, that's my presentation.
So my name is Annie Carlson. I'm a biology major, also pre-med. So when I was deciding what I wanted to do, I've always been interested in women's health, and I wanted to do something that was applicable to college students here. So I'm looking at variations in cortisol levels across women's menstrual cycle. For all of my OChem, biochem friends out there, that's cortisol structure. You can tell by the 4-ring structure that it's a steroid hormone. Yay. So background, cortisol is a stress hormone that's produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That means that in your brain you have the hypothalamus, which communicates to the pituitary gland, which then communicates to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. Stress can influence the menstrual cycle length and regularity, so the typical cycle length is 28 days long, and this is controlled by another axis called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So it communicates in females with their ovaries, which regulates the production of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And in the menstrual cycle, there are 2 distinct phases, the follicular and luteal phase, which are on average about 14 days in length. So here's a little illustration showing kind of your brain as your headquarters, which then communicates on down through hormone cascades to different organs and glands. This is an illustration of how hormones vary across the entire menstrual cycle. So you can see that there is menstruation, and then in the middle, around the 14-day mark, is when ovulation occurs, so right before ovulation, there's a sudden spike in estrogen and luteinizing hormone, and then that goes down, and then progesterone spikes. So it's all just these different waves. So I hypothesized that cortisol levels would be higher in the follicular phase than in the luteal phase, so higher when women are menstruating than when they are not. And then I also hypothesized that there would be higher overall cortisol levels in females with long or abnormal menstrual cycles. So my participants are from Bethel College here. I recruited them last spring, so over the summer they could track when their period began and stopped. And using this data, I calculated the average cycle length for each person. Then when menstruation began in September or October, they'd let me know, and we'd collect a saliva sample, and then we'd collect another saliva sample approximately 2 weeks after. So I had a sample from when they were on their period and when they weren't in both phases. Using grant money, I was able to give all my participants a $5 Mojo's gift card, so they'd have some incentive, which is always nice. And since I was collecting saliva samples, because that's where the cortisol hormone would be in, I had to do COVID precautions, so I put all my samples in a water bath for 30 minutes just to kill any potential viral particles in the saliva. Then once I collected all my samples, I headed on down to WSU to do what's called an ELISA. This stands for Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent Assay, and that's to determine the amount of cortisol hormone in each sample. We don't have the equipment necessary here to do that, which is why I had to go down there. And I haven't analyzed my data yet to see if my hypotheses are true or not. I'll do that in our studio later. So I'd like to thank the URICA committee for the grant money. Really want to thank my amazing advisor, Fran. William White, he was the guy down at WSU who helped me out in the lab. Sandy, I also begged her to come with me so I'd have a friend, and she was so helpful. And then my other 3 research assistants, Mickey, Katie, and Claire, they've helped me with gathering saliva samples with participants when I couldn't be there, helping me find literature for my lit review, and yeah.
Hi everyone, so my name is Emma Beachy, and as Dr. Milliman said earlier, I am a senior studying history and music, and as you can see, my project is entitled Acculturation and Tradition, Mary Oyer and Expanding Social Conscience in Mennonite Music. So as some of you may have heard, actually at a few of our recent convocations, the Mennonite Church recently released a new hymnal. And as someone who's interested both in Mennonite history and in Mennonite music, I recently found myself thinking quite a lot about past Mennonite hymnals and their connections to denominational identity and culture. And that led me to the life of Mary Oyer, who is the most important figure in Mennonite music of the 20th century. And she was part of the two previous hymnal committees that preceded this new one. So I proposed a project to explore the connections that her story shows us between changing Mennonite musical practice and growing social consciousness in the North American Mennonite Church. And I received URICA funding to work on this project over the summer. So a bit about my research process. I spent the first part of the summer reading secondary sources about Mennonite history, Mennonite musical practice, and American Protestant church music more broadly. In the middle of June, I traveled to Goshen, Indiana, where I spent 10 days working in both the Mennonite Historical Library at Goshen College and the Mennonite Church USA archives. And there I was looking at correspondence, meeting minutes, interviews, hymnal proofs, periodicals, and a whole bunch of other primary documents. It was really a gold mine. And I also got a chance while I was there to interview a couple of people. So I interviewed Rebecca Slough, who worked on one of the hymnal committees I was examining, and I got to meet Mary Oyer herself, who is 98 and currently lives in an assisted living facility in Goshen. And she was really helpful to me, and it was just a fantastic experience to meet her. That was definitely a highlight of this entire project. So I got home from Goshen and spent the rest of the summer, July and August, outlining and drafting the paper, and then went through several rounds of revisions this fall. And I have just submitted the finished product to a journal for publication, and that is also a really exciting part of this. So just briefly, I'll give all of you a taste of my thesis here. So I argue that Mary Oyer participated on varying sides of conflicts that emerged in Mennonite music over race, gender, denominational affiliation, and theology throughout her career, both pushing for transformation and clinging to tradition. And her life demonstrates the tensions and contradictions inherent in the 20th century Mennonite experience of expanding social conscience as expressed through music. And so if you'd like to hear more about how I go about proving that claim, you can come to the symposium in the spring. And I really have to thank the URICA committee. So I had to spend a significant amount of time in Goshen to do this project, and that wouldn't have been feasible during the semester. So this funding meant that I was able to do this work over the summer instead of having to get a job, and that is really crucial. I would not have been able to do this without them. And I also need to say thanks to Kip Weedle, who has been my advisor on this project and has really been an incredible resource throughout the whole project. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sandy Dow. I'm a senior biology major, and if you have a class in the KSC and you wonder why it smells like a pizzeria, this is the research that did that. Anyway, so what I envisioned for my research is to compare the antibacterial effects of various essential oils on human pathogenic bacteria. I'm using thyme, black pepper, and garlic essential oils against E. coli and S. aureus. I'll be looking for the antibacterial effects of the different essential oils and their varying concentration against the bacterial strains to represent gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. So my hypotheses are there'll be a decrease of bacterial growth on all tested plates. An increase of essential oil concentration will lead to a decrease in bacterial growth. Gram-negative bacteria will be more resistant to the essential oil variants, while gram-positive bacteria will be more sensitive. And then the method that I'm using is the Kirby-Barr disc diffusion method to test antibiotic susceptibility. This method relies on the inhibition of bacterial growth measure and under standard conditions. So I'm using two different types of agar. I'm using LB agar for E. coli and then brain heart infusion agar for S. aureus. I'm using the concentrations 100%, 50%, and 25%, and I'm diluting them with DMSO. And then I will determine the antibiotic susceptibility by measuring the zone of inhibition. The zone of inhibitions are the little white circles on the aftergrowth one. So I'll be looking at the diameter of that to determine its antimicrobial effect. And the significance of this research is because antibiotic resistance bacteria is rising, so I wanted to look at a natural way to combat that issue using essential oils, as bacteria typically doesn't become resistant to natural substances like this. And I'm using E. coli and S. aureus because those are the two most common pathogens in the human body. And so for my acknowledgements, I would like to thank Fran, because she's my primary advisor. I would like to thank Katie Lehman, because she helps me with the filtering of my essential oils, my research assistants, Anna, Maddie, and Gabby. I would also really like to thank the URICA committee for making this possible. I've spent my funds paying for essential oils, my syringes, and quite a few mistakes that I've made in the lab. I've made plenty of them. So that was really nice that they're funded for. And then I would also like to thank Adam and Shayla, because they occasionally came in to help me in the lab.
Hi, good morning. My name is Natalie Graber, and I'll be presenting on my topic, physical therapy for acute musculoskeletal injuries, the role of patient-therapist relationships on patient-perceived rehabilitation success. So first, I am a natural sciences and psychology double major on my pre-PT track, so that's why I am combining those two to do this project. I really wanted to explore the topics in the field of physical therapy, and I needed that psychological aspect, so here I am talking about patient-therapist relationships. So this will also help me going into the PT field and attending KU next year. I'm really excited about that. So some key aspects to my study is talking about this therapeutic alliance, which is the working relationship between patient and therapist. So this term therapeutic alliance actually came from psychological therapy and the relationship between psychotherapist and the patient. So this study that I looked at applied that construct to physical therapy, and that was just kind of the beginning of the research that I've done in patient-therapist relationships. So then some later studies also kind of coined it more as the patient-therapist interaction. And then I also wanted to include the aspect of patient-defined rehabilitation success because this model defines rehabilitation through the patient's perspective and looks kind of outside of clinical outcomes, but also how the patient feels about their therapy and how it went, kind of looking at the confidence they have leaving therapy. So again, down here, it emphasizes a patient's desires, beliefs, and expectations, and utilizes them in making decisions on what constitutes as a successful treatment outcome. So my data collection methods here, I'm going to be using the Patient-Centered Outcome Questionnaire, or shortened to the PCOQ survey, which basically asks scale questions from 0 to 100, rating pain, interference with day-to-day activities, emotional distress, kind of other aspects like that. And then I'll be pairing that with a patient satisfaction survey, which is on a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, just asking the patient about their relationship with their therapist. One of the questions is my therapist listens to my concerns, or my therapist tells me about what I'm going through in this rehabilitation. So just kind of comparing those surveys back to back and kind of combining that with a PT clinic that I will be working through. I shadowed over the summer at NMC Health here in Newton, and waiting for my physical therapist to get back from maternity leave to kind of get that into gear. And then also looking at adding the athletic training clinic here on campus to my survey. I'm working on an IRB edit as we speak to actually get that approved. But so I'll be able to actually compare the athletic training clinic data with my PT clinic data and kind of look at the differences that might be there. So because I might be adding athletic training to my study, I will not be able to disclose the hypothesis, as some of you in the crowd might be a part of my study. So sorry about that. For data analysis, I will be, like I said, comparing PT and AT survey data. I'll be comparing them within each clinic, as well as kind of cross-contaminating them, as you could say, comparing PT to AT. I'll be running all through my statistics through our studio. This will help me determine the relationships between the variables using things like linear regressions. I will be asking Brad to help me on that. And then from there, I'll analyze and discuss what I find. And those are several of my references. First of all, I'd love to thank the URICA committee for this opportunity, using my funding to help compensate the clinics for the work that they're putting in. A lot of the PT clinics that I've talked to are really overwhelmed with COVID protocols and just feeling like their bandwidth is stretched thin, so I'd like to thank them for their participation in that sense as well. Fran, my amazing advisor all along, thank you so much for her help. Brad Celestin, Dan Stigley, and Dwight Crable as well. And then also my student assistant, Gracie Higgins. So thank you so much.
Now is an opportunity to ask questions. I'd ask the presenters to join me up here, and if you could come to the microphone up front and direct your question at one of our presenters, and they'll be able to field that question. Here comes one of our older students.
Thank you. I'd like you to briefly describe the journey to your project. What got you started, and how did that journey transpire?
Well, I briefly talked about it, but kind of where it really started was freshman year. I had to be a research assistant for a senior student who also looked at cortisol as a biomarker, and I thought that was really interesting. And then through my journey to wanting to become a physician, I really like women's health, and I think that's important, and it's often under-researched, so I wanted to implement that into my study. And then as college students, we're all stressed, so I thought about how you go in phases when you're on, this is for girls, when you're on your menstrual cycle, of how you feel good and how you don't feel good, so then I wanted to look at a biomarker specifically for that.
The genesis for my idea, the 1-year anniversary is actually going to be over Christmas break, because I remember listening to the music for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and thinking, wow, this would make a really fun research project, because I really enjoy the writings of C.S. Lewis and read them as a child. And also, I think that children and publishing for children is incredibly important. Ideas sort of really imprint themselves on kids. And so I really wanted to trace how a lot of those ideas that are present in C.S. Lewis's books, because it's part of why he's famous, sort of inspired him in particular, and what the history of those ideas was. And so that's sort of how I became interested in my topic and why I chose to pursue that.
So I talked a little bit about this earlier. I said I was kind of looking at the new hymnal and interested in that. But actually, there's a very specific thing that triggered my real interest in this, which is that in the Anabaptist world in 2019, I saw this article about some past Mennonite hymnals and their interactions with church politics. And in that article, there was this source, a letter to Mary Oyer, that I found so interesting. I was like, oh, this is really cool. I need to look into this a little more. And I actually was able to find that source then in the archives, which was really exciting.
For me, I kind of picked up my psychology second major, I think just before my junior year, so I really needed something to combine the seminars both together. And I've always wanted to be a PT for a very long time, honestly, and so I really thought this would be a great way to see what are the ways that I can improve on and be a better therapist for my patients, so yeah.
I've always been fascinated with the weather. I remember seeing a tornado when I was about 10 or 11 years old at my house. I was able to secure a shadowing opportunity down at the station when I was in high school. Just kind of been driven off of this love for weather and like a thunderstorm rolling across the sky in the evening. And then when I got here, I thought, my proximity to Wichita could lend itself to some internship opportunities, and that could help me further my research into, how, okay, so this stuff happened, but why do we know that it happened? How are we able to predict that? And so that's what led me to what I'm doing now.
My topic for research came from, over the summer I shadowed a chiropractor and he was really big on alternative medicine, so I found it interesting to use some form of alternative medicine into medicine to help battle the rise in antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I've always been interested in that topic. I'm also going to PA school next year, so I wanted something that would be, I'm missing the word. Yes, clinically relevant.
So since about 12, I've always loved marine biology. And then about 14, I started to get really into reading about genetics and like designer babies and stuff like that. So I actually wanted to marry the two. And I remember just sitting in the car with my mom and emailing Fran and was like, how can I put the two together? Originally, I was supposed to do a coral research with genetics, and then that turned into a coral survey, and then that kind of all fell through, and then it started with turtles. But I'm super excited because I love working with the animals, but I also just really like the marine biology and the genetics kind of marrying together and seeing what career path I can have with that.
Someone else.
So all of your projects are really amazing. Could you talk a little bit, so I know there are a lot of juniors out here who are just starting to think about our senior projects. Could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you faced and some advice you would give to juniors?
Really consult your advisors. Tell them kind of things that you might be interested in, like certain topics or certain subjects. I think almost all of us had something that really fascinated us, and so we just talked to our advisors and they kind of helped us figure out a plan with that. And then also try to make sure that you have a solid plan by the end of your junior year, because if you don't, it's really hard when all the hiccups start to happen. Like a lot of us have had issues with COVID and other things, and so just make sure that you are, one, planning ahead, but two, really bounce your ideas off your advisor. That will help you a lot.
If you need to write an IRB for like human participants or something like that, get started on that in your junior year because it can be a lengthy process and you want to have that done by the time you come for your senior year so you can get started with that right away and you don't have to wait for that whole process.
So everyone's path is different. I would say when it comes time to submit your proposal, at least in my instance, so like I thought that I could take the equations that I showed you up on the screen and like maybe forecast like wind or something out 7 days. And as I got further into looking at my lit review stuff, I saw, okay, no, there's no way. So I kind of had to go back to the drawing board. And so in terms of applying for, or like when you're first thinking about things, it's okay to not necessarily have a direct plan, depending on what you're gonna do. If you have to submit an IRB, that certainly complicates things if you try to change directions. But for me, as someone who didn't have to do that, it made changing a little bit easier. So I would say you don't have to have it 100% figured out in your head, but certainly thinking on it early gets the ball rolling.
My best piece of advice would be to find something that you want to sit with for a while, because if you pick something that you like initially and then you burn out on it, that's not fun, and you don't want this project to be drudgery. So pick something that you're really willing to commit to for a long period of time, and also give yourself grace for flexibility as well.
I would have to agree on starting a little bit your junior year, like really start thinking about topics that you want to do your junior year, and then over the summer you could start lit review research or like finding articles or something like that. And then also don't, like you're going to have your whole senior year to do this basically, but like try to get it done like fall semester, like start working on taking it serious as soon as possible because you don't know what's going to happen. Like for me, I had like a set mental schedule and I'm not on it because of the mistakes that have occurred. So yeah.
Yeah, I would say I'm someone that's always been a big planner, and so I had this great idea in my head, and I had a timeline, and then, clinics were kind of saying, hey, we just don't have the bandwidth to do your survey, just with COVID protocols, and everyone's just kind of worn out. So I would say make a plan, but expect bumps along the way.
Thank you.
I have 2 bits of advice. One, if you have an idea, talk to your advisor early. You need your advisor's permission for them to be your advisor. Don't presume upon that. And then secondly, I'm the one who screens the IRBs, at least initially. Make sure you spend good time on that and that they're clearly written, aren't questions, otherwise it'll go back and forth and back and forth. Make sure your advisor signs off on the IRBs as well. Anything else? Another question. These are good. Here we go.
Do you have a particular piece of information that you found like particularly interesting, or like a story that was kind of a highlight of your project so far?
I'll share something that I found particularly interesting. So one of the things I was looking at was Mennonite use of instruments in the early 1960s and growing acceptance among Mennonites of the use of instruments. And today I think this is something that can seem kind of like this weird, quaint thing that used to be a problem. Who would care if you're using instruments or not? But I found it was extremely interesting that the use of instruments and music as a whole really became this site of conflict over Mennonite identity, over what it means to be Mennonite, what it means to belong in a community and to have a faith. And so that was really, really intriguing. And people got extremely passionate about this. There's an actual document that I read that compares the use of musical instruments to murder, warfare, and polygamy. Like it puts them on the same level, which it's just so intriguing to kind of see that perspective as it was felt at the time.
So I'd say I have 2 highlights. The first being during my initial research, something that I found super interesting was those equations that I showed you on the screen. People tried using those to write a forecast by hand because they were doing exploration in the early 1900s. And the guy that tried doing it by himself, it took him 2 weeks to forecast a period over 8 hours, and he eventually came to a conclusion that was impossible, like an impossible pressure fall or something. And he concluded that it would take a team of 60,000 people working tirelessly around the clock to produce forecasts by hand that could actually be practical in their use. And so that was kind of a shortfall until we came up with a computer in the 50s. But I thought that was really, really interesting. And then a second highlight for me was, I would say, during my internship time, being able to see yourself on the green screen for the first time is just wild because you can't see anything behind you. So it's kind of cool to be able to see what the professionals do, and yeah, it's cool.
Something interesting to me was actually like how much a lot of marine biology life is not really researched, especially in genetics. With the corals, I struggled to even find any information, any genetic information to kind of compare my study to someone else's study. And the same kind of is going with turtles. I do have one genetic thing, but it took me a while to find some type of genetic information on these turtles, and there's only so much. And so that's like a little bit harder, but it was definitely interesting because like you would think we talk about saving the turtles all the time, but there's barely any research genetically on turtles, so yeah.
Well, it's quarter till, and I want to thank these presenters. You all did a marvelous job, and I'm very proud of you and your work here at Bethel College. You represent yourselves well and Bethel as well. Let's give them a concluding round of applause. And you are dismissed. Have a good Thanksgiving.